There is something strange about people who have truly awakened spiritually. They don't flinch. Not the way someone militarily trained holds themselves in check. Not like someone suppressing something that threatens to explode, but in a way that sits beneath the surface, in the eyes, in the way they hold their body when the world around them is coming apart. And Carl Jung spent decades trying to explain exactly why. What he found disturbs the comfortable story most people tell themselves about what calm actually is, because it turns out that the stillness you see in these people is not a skill. It is not a technique. It is the result of something most people never attempt. Something you notice before you can explain it. Before any conversation begins. Before anything meaningful is exchanged. You can look at them in the middle of chaos, and something in your mind makes a wrong calculation. You assume the situation is affecting them the way it would affect anyone, and you discover it isn't. You assume they are suppressing fear, and you discover there is nothing to suppress. Jung noticed this. He spent decades working with patients at every stage of psychological development, and among the things he documented was this quiet, persistent phenomenon. People who had moved through genuine spiritual awakening responded to pressure in a way that could not be explained by temperament, by training, or by attitude. Something more fundamental was happening. And when Jung traced that something back to its source, what he found disturbs the comfortable story most people tell themselves about what calm actually is, because most of us believe that calm is control. We believe the person who stays composed under pressure is someone who has learned to manage their emotions, to contain them, to keep the lid on what lies underneath. But Jung's clinical observations pointed towards something entirely different. He believed that what most people call calm is not calm at all. It is containment. It is the chronic tension of holding something that cannot be released, maintained with such consistency that it stops feeling like effort and simply starts feeling like who you are. And real calm, the kind Jung observed in those who had moved through genuine awakening, was the opposite of this. It was not the effort of holding anything. It was the absence of the need to. To understand the difference, we need to understand what most people are carrying when pressure arrives. Jung observed that the average person moves through adult life in a state of profound psychological compression. Not because they chose this, because the world around them required it from an early age. You learned quickly that certain emotions were acceptable and others were not. Certain versions of you were welcomed, celebrated, rewarded. Other versions, the angry you, the frightened you, the you that simply wanted to stop performing, those were quietly discouraged until they disappeared underground. Jung called what accumulated down there the shadow. Not something evil, not something inherently dangerous, simply everything the conscious mind refused to acknowledge. All the feelings that had nowhere safe to go. And while the conscious mind carried on with ordinary life, the shadow grew heavier. Every year of not feeling what needed to be felt added weight. Not metaphorical weight, real neurological weight. The kind that alters the quality of your breath. The kind that keeps the nervous system in a background state of activation that never fully switches off. And then pressure arrives. A crisis. A threat. A moment when the world demands something you don't have. And here is where everything is revealed. Because the person carrying decades of unprocessed emotional material is also carrying decades of unresolved reactivity. The present activates the past. Today's insult wakes the humiliation of 20 years ago. Today's threat summons the fear of childhood. And the response that emerges is not a response to what is happening now. It is the accumulated sum of everything that was never processed. Jung called this complex inflation. The moment a fragment of unintegrated past takes over the response to the present and amplifies it beyond what the actual situation justifies. This is what most people are managing when pressure arrives. not the present moment. The entirety of what they have been carrying activated all at once. And now here is where something important shifts. Because the spiritually awakened person, the one who remains still while everyone else is coming undone, that person has typically lived through more difficulty, not less. They have often experienced loss that broke them open, betrayal that shattered their fundamental assumptions about the world, periods of psychological darkness that lasted not weeks but years. If anything, the events of their life would seem to justify being more reactive, not less. And yet the opposite is true. Why? Jung's answer to this question is what changed everything I thought I understood about calm. He believed that it is not difficulty that destabilizes a person. It is the resistance to difficulty. It is the suppression of what difficulty asks you to feel. If you have ever watched someone stay completely still while everything around them collapsed, leave the word "still" in the comments. You will understand exactly why in a moment. The person who moves through genuine spiritual awakening has at some point stopped resisting. They have learned, often through enormous suffering, to feel what is actually there instead of managing what they don't want to be there. And that single shift, from resistance to allowance, from suppression to integration, begins releasing the accumulated weight that for years was generating reactivity from within. The process is not comfortable. Jung was very clear about this. Genuine spiritual awakening is not the peaceful, serene experience the wellness industry tends to describe. It often forces encounters with everything the person has been running from. The pain they never completed. The anger they never allowed themselves to feel without guilt. The shame that was assigned to them before they had any capacity to evaluate whether it actually belonged to them. This confrontation, which Jung placed at the center of what he called individuation, the lifelong process of becoming psychologically whole. This confrontation is where real calm begins. Because when a person finally feels the grief they have been holding for 20 years, something releases, not just emotionally, physiologically. The jaw unclenches. It had been clenched so long, the person stopped noticing. The breath drops deeper into the body than it has in years. The nervous system, which had been running a constant background program of containment and management, receives a signal it may have been waiting years for. Something is safe now. You don't have to hold this anymore. And what follows is something that everyone around the awakening person notices before the awakening person themselves understands what is happening. They no longer react the same way, not because they are suppressing the reaction, but because the material that was fueling the reaction has been processed. It has completed its arc. It is no longer stored, partially activated, waiting for the right trigger. This is what Jung observed about calm under pressure. It is not an acquired skill. It is not a practiced technique. It is the natural result of a nervous system that is no longer carrying decades of incomplete emotional experiences waiting to resolve. The reactive person is not reactive because they are weak. They are reactive because they are carrying something enormous that was never processed. And every new pressure ignites the old alongside the new. The awakened person is not unmovable because they are cold. They are stable because there is nothing stored that pressure can ignite. There is another layer to this that goes even deeper, and it is the layer that most people miss entirely. It has to do not just with what the awakened person releases, but with what they reclaim. Jung understood something about the people who had moved through genuine individuation. They had reclaimed parts of themselves that had been underground for years, sometimes decades. The sensitivity, they had been told, was weakness. The anger they had been taught to feel ashamed of, which was actually the healthy signal that their boundaries were being violated. The capacity to be genuinely present with what is happening, without simultaneously managing what they don't want to be happening. These qualities, when they have been underground for years, are not dead, they are dormant. And when the awakening process brings them back into consciousness, the person doesn't just feel more whole psychologically. They respond more wholly to pressure, because pressure no longer activates a file of unresolved pain. It activates someone who is genuinely here, someone whose response to the present moment is not contaminated by the accumulation of all the moments that were never completed. Jung documented something about how spiritually awakened people relate to their own emotions that contributes directly to this phenomenon. And it is almost the opposite of what popular culture suggests emotional health looks like. Most people either suppress their emotions, pushing them underground to avoid disruption, or are overwhelmed by them, swept away in feelings that seem to have no edges. The awakened person who has moved through genuine psychological work has developed something different: the ability to feel fully without being destroyed by feeling. When you can feel fear completely, let it move through you in its full weight, without needing to stop it or escape it. The fear completes its arc. The threat is assessed, the response is chosen, and the system returns to baseline. Jung called this the natural arc of emotion. Every emotion, if allowed to move without interruption, has a beginning, a peak, and a resolution. Not necessarily a pleasant resolution, but a completion. Most people never experience emotional completion. They interrupt their emotions at various stages because the full experience feels too threatening. They suppress before the feeling can build. They manage when it peaks. They distract before it can resolve, and so the emotion doesn't complete. It stays in the system, partially activated, drawing on resources indefinitely, ready to be reignited by any future pressure that resembles it closely enough. The awakened person has learned, often through suffering that made suppression impossible, to let the arc complete, and the nervous system that regularly completes its emotional cycles is not chronically storing unfinished experiences. It is a system that releases, and systems that release respond to pressure in a fundamentally different way from systems that accumulate. There is one final dimension to this that Jung explored in his work on meaning, and this may be the most powerful of all. He observed that the people who responded most reactively to pressure, who were most easily destabilized by circumstances, were often not the people who had experienced the most hardship. They were the people who were living without a sense of genuine meaning, who had constructed lives that were externally coherent but internally hollow, who had accumulated the things society defined as success without ever asking whether those things actually corresponded to who they were. Jung believed that the deepest source of stability in a human being is not psychological. It is the experience of living in genuine alignment with one's authentic nature. When a person is living from the self, with a capital S, genuinely expressing what they are rather than performing what they believe will be accepted, the entire system operates differently. There is no internal friction consuming energy. There is no gap between who you are and who you are pretending to be. And when pressure arrives for someone living from that alignment, it does not find the contradiction it is looking to ignite. There is no gap to widen. There is no suppressed version of the self that crisis can invoke. What it finds is simply someone who is here, whole, present, with nothing stored that pressure can use against them. Jung observed that his awakened patients, those who had moved into genuine alignment with their authentic nature, who had found work that expressed rather than suppressed what they were, who had released relationships that required them to be less than what they were, who had stopped pursuing goals that someone else had decided were appropriate for them. Those patients carried a stability that was almost inexplicable from the outside. They had often simplified their lives dramatically, and yet they seemed more grounded than before, not despite the simplification. Because of it. Because living simply in alignment is metabolically different from living elaborately in contradiction. The nervous system that is not maintaining a split between inner reality and outer presentation finally gets to function as it was designed to function. And all of that collectively registers in a way that other people perceive as a calm that cannot be shaken, without being able to explain exactly what they are seeing, because they are not seeing a technique. They are seeing the absence of an enormous invisible effort, the effort of not being what one actually is. What you are beginning to understand now is why this is not primarily about spiritual practices or rituals or anything external. It is about the internal work of becoming honest with yourself at a depth most people never attempt. Jung's contribution to understanding human calm was not a stress management protocol. It was a psychological one. He observed that we become reactive prematurely, not because biology is cruel, but because most of us spend enormous portions of our lives in states of internal suppression, performance, self-abandonment, and inauthenticity that generate reactivity on a timeline that chronological time alone would never produce. And the reversal of this, a genuine awakening that reclaims what was suppressed, that integrates what was hidden, that allows the person to live from their actual nature rather than their constructed one. This reversal doesn't just change how the person feels, it changes how the person responds to pressure, to chaos, to the moments when the world demands something of you, and the question is who you actually are when performance is no longer possible. The awakened person does not stop pressure. They stop contributing to their own reactivity through the ongoing accumulation of what they were never designed to carry indefinitely. There is a final observation worth making because it completes the picture in a way that is both unsettling and, if you are ready to hear it, genuinely freeing. The spiritually awakened person who remains calm under pressure that undoes everyone else has not discovered a shortcut. They have not avoided suffering. They have not found a way to bypass the hard things that life brings to everyone. In almost every case, they have moved through more difficulty than the average person. Not less. They've felt things more fully, lost more things more completely, been broken open in ways that most people successfully avoid for an entire lifetime. The reason pressure does not sweep them away is not that less happened to them. It is that they processed what happened rather than storing it. They completed their grief rather than containing it. They integrated their shadow rather than maintaining the exhausting effort of keeping it invisible. They stopped performing their life and began actually living it, often at enormous social cost, often at the price of relationships and roles and identities that had previously organized their entire world. And on the other side of that, they arrived somewhere, not into ease or comfort necessarily, into authenticity, into alignment, into a relationship with their own existence that generates stability from within, rather than consuming it in the management of an internal contradiction. And when pressure arrives, as it always does, what it finds is simply this: the body of a person who is no longer at war with themselves, the mind of a person who has stopped holding the world at bay with the effort of not being what they are. The presence of someone who has looked into their own darkness, integrated what they found, and emerged carrying less than they arrived with. There is nothing there for pressure to ignite. Not because the person is empty, but because they are, finally, whole. This is what Jung observed. This is what he spent decades trying to understand and document. And this is what waits on the other side of the kind of psychological honesty that most people never attempt, not because they can't, but because no one ever showed them that the cost of avoidance was always written into the way they respond when the world finally puts them to the test. You are not here by accident. Something in you already knows this is true. Perhaps you have seen it in someone. Perhaps you have felt it in yourself in a moment when something released that you had been holding for years, and for a brief time, you responded to something impossibly difficult, with a calm you did not know you possessed. That was real. That was not an illusion. That was your system showing you what becomes possible when the weight is put down. The path to it is not comfortable, but the arrival, as everyone who has made it will tell you, looks very different from the outside than most people expect. Not mystical, not transcendent in any dramatic sense. Just quietly, unmistakably present. And that presence is the only armor that no pressure can ever penetrate.